So I am Miranda Brown, and I am here to welcome you to LRCCS Tuesday noon lecture series. So before I introduce the speaker and we get sort of started, I'm going to make a few announcements. So I wish to welcome you to the first presentation in the noon lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for the Center for Chinese Studies for fall 2022. And my goodness, this is the first time I've been in this room in person in 2.5 years, so woohoo, maybe we're out of this almost. Now, the complete series schedule is available here today and on the China Center website. Email reminders are sent out weekly. I'll begin with some announcements. So on Thursday, September 22nd, LSA will present the inaugural lecture in the Kenneth G. Lieberthal and Richard H. Rogel Professor of Chinese Studies Lecture Series. The talk will be given by An Lin, Associate Professor in the Ford School Public Policy and Director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, who will be speaking on, quote, scapegoating Chinese-American scientists in the name of national security. And I'd like you all to come to this lecture. This is a very important topic that's very close to my heart, and it's absolutely sort of vital importance. And the talk will take place on the 10th floor of Weiser Hall at 4:30 p.m., and all are welcome to attend. The next presentation in the fall 2022 LRCCS noon lecture series will take place on Tuesday, September 27th, and will be given by Sangzarema Ujid, who will be speaking on reincarnations of power amongst the Mongols from Monka Tengri, I think I just butchered that, to the Siditu Lama. Okay, I butchered that one as well. Per is probably shaking his head right now. Okay, so today's presentation will be given by Dr. Peter Braden, postdoctoral fellow in the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies of the University of Michigan. He is a historian whose research interests include environmental history, science and technology studies, and animal studies. His first book manuscript is entitled Serve the People, Bovine Experiences in China's Civil War and Revolution, 1935 to 1961. Pete is using his time at LRCCS to hang out with me, but also to publish his first book and to develop his second monograph, Collateral Killing, Humans, Rodents, and Medicine in China, 1940 to 1980. Before joining the LRCCS, he received his doctorate in history from the University of California at San Diego and completed an An Wang postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University's Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. Today, he will be speaking on trips and traps, how rodents in China and America experienced the Korean War. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Miranda. I'm honored to be giving this noon lecture at the LRCCS, and thank you to all the center staff, including Ina, Dohi, Peggy, Guicho, and Carol, for helping to set this up, and to Anne, Lan, and Miranda for their support during my fellowship. Also, thanks to this in-person audience. I'm glad to see you here, and also to our friends joining us today on Zoom. I'll be talking, actually, there will be a slight difference in this presentation from what was advertised, and we will address that in a moment. But the title of today's talk will be Deadly Pseudoscience, Rodents and Plague During China's Hygienic Warfare Campaign of 1952. I am a multi-species historian. What does this mean? Well, historians conventionally describe non-humans as pests, property, pets, significant, in other words, only insofar as they relate to human agendas. Multi-species history, on the other hand, treats non-humans as agents and subjects. Agents can modify their environments and cause humans to exert their own energy and expertise and use their capital in response to the actions of these non-humans. Subjects are capable of planning, emotion, social bonds, memory. In other words, they have inner lives. And so you're probably thinking, a historian, of course, draws their evidence from documents. If non-human animals don't write letters or keep diaries, where is Pete getting his material from? My method is to integrate two bodies of literature, the first being the scientific literature of cognitive animal behavior science and animal ethology, the science of animal minds, veterinary medicine. The second body of literature is the primary documents generated by people of the period under study as they interacted with animals. So when they would observe, this animal's emaciated, this animal is making such and such a vocalization, this animal is displaying such and such a behavior, we can pair that with the literature of animal science, of animal intelligence, to make cautious and kind of parsimonious, but I hope persuasive, arguments about what the animals in question were feeling and experiencing at the time they were observed. My first book, as Miranda mentioned, is about how bovines, cattle, water buffalo, and yaks experienced the Pacific War, or the Second World War, and the Chinese Civil War of the 1930s and 40s, and then how they experienced the economic transformations of the 1950s. But today we're talking about a different episode in multi-species history involving humans, insects, rodents, and bacteria. And this began with some accusations of American biological warfare, and I'm going to use the abbreviation BW for biological warfare. Sometimes you'll see it as bacteriological, but in fact, because it sometimes uses viruses or other organisms, I think biological is slightly more accurate. BW, you'll hear that term a lot. In February of 1952, top leaders of the People's Republic of China issued some shocking allegations of American BW attacks on Chinese and North Korean soldiers. And they launched a couple of anti-BW, or a couple of environmental hygiene campaigns, the anti-BW 反细菌战 and patriotic hygiene campaign, 爱国卫生运动. Okay, these involved a lot of quite reasonable, common sense methods for improving environmental hygiene, such as cleaning up people's homes, eliminating pools of standing water that insects use to reproduce, digging wells for drinking water, and remodeling homes to have toilets that were separated from the main living areas. These campaigns also involved killing huge numbers of animals that might be vectors for diseases. These included flies, mosquitoes, fleas, and rodents. In the summer of 1952, the International Scientific Commission, or abbreviated as ISC and sometimes called the Needham Commission, after its most prominent member, Joseph Needham, the scientist and cynologist. This commission of global scientists visited China and conducted an investigation of these BW attacks, these allegations. They were very closely monitored and guided by the Chinese authorities, and then they issued a very thick report supporting the allegations of BW. And so what exactly did they talk about? Well, as the government promoted the idea of American BW attacks, civilians and soldiers across the country were encouraged to collect and submit animals and any suspicious materials for microscopic analysis. There were many such incidents where people would find a pile of chicken feathers or a bag full of strange insects, and the government's proclamations emphasized that these mysterious items were dropped by American airplanes, although many had no traces of pathogens. One noteworthy instance was in one morning in Gannan County in northeastern China's Heilongjiang province. People awoke to find approximately 800 dead or dying voles. A vole is a small rodent like a field mouse near their village. And here is an image from the ISC report suggesting that these supposedly plague-bearing voles might have arrived via airdropped cardboard tubes. And you can see the parachute at the back here, and here's the tube, and here's these little voles making their getaway. This fascinating explanation cannot account for the fact that no remnants of any such tubes were found, nor any of the ballast that would have helped it to fall accurately, as the ISC investigators themselves noted. The authors also suggested that the tubes might have self-incinerated, although, again, no fire or ashes were found. And the ISC finally suggested that the animals might have been anesthetized during their airborne journey. It's worth noting, I think, that the ISC team became aware of this possible scenario when the Chinese pathologist Bai Xiqing, who was working with them, directed them to an article that appeared in a Japanese newspaper and featured this illustration. We will talk more about this, but intelligence services often use foreign press to kind of launder narratives into mainstream discourse. So we can just bear that in mind. In addition to the ISC report, the PRC government set up a huge display in Beijing and sent a traveling exhibition throughout friendly European countries. The show and the exhibition featured highly magnified images of microbes without much context or details about how they were discovered. And it left the viewer with a kind of sense of menace, but not a rigorous explanation of how these organisms were discovered or how these sightings occurred. There has been an enormous amount of scholarly debate about this issue, and some of it is quite heated for understandable reasons. It's a sensitive topic. In the last few decades, evidence has become available that I believe allows us to reject the notion of American BW. Instead, I argue that this was a deception organized by the senior leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. The environmental hygiene campaigns were launched in bad faith, but the civilians, cadres, and soldiers who participated in the campaigns did so from a sincere belief that America was attacking their country. And why not? Memories of the Japanese BW program at Unit 731 in Manchuria, where they did appalling human experimentation and used those microbes developed there in attacks on Chinese cities, including Ningbo in Zhejiang province and Changde in Hunan province. Those memories were still very fresh. Furthermore, America had used nuclear weapons against Japan, so there was clearly not an ethical problem with weapons of mass destruction. And the Chinese government promoted some very inflammatory and scary messaging that we will see about BW. So the vast majority of participants in the campaign acted in good faith, but were deceived by their own leaders for reasons we will discuss. A few points on the new evidence. Wu Zhili was the health director of the logistics department of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army in Korea, so he was very well positioned to understand what was going on. His conclusion in a memoir published in 2013 was that the BW attack was a false alarm, 虚惊. He describes the political pressure that he and his colleagues were under and the fraudulent way that the alleged BW samples were gathered. His essay, unfortunately, is no longer available on Yanhuang Chunqiu, a formerly very prestigious journal of modern history, although in the last few years, several new essays have appeared in that journal arguing that America indeed carried out BW in Korea. The consensus in China until the 90s was firmly in favor of the BW explanation, but there was a period in the early 2000s when those claims were muted or downplayed. The political winds have shifted again, and it is now expedient to suggest that America was doing BW in that campaign. Other evidence came from Soviet records declassified after the Cold War. Soviet diplomats wrote home to the Foreign Ministry in March 1953 that Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai were very awkward and uneasy during a conversation about supposed BW. And during this conversation, the Soviet diplomats were informing these supreme leaders that the Soviet Union would no longer proclaim this narrative publicly. And during their conversation, Mao kind of, drank a lot of tea, smoked very heavily, acted quite nervous, and blamed low-level military personnel for starting these rumors and for getting out of hand. He also likened it to the fact that some of the people killed during the land reform and the anti-counter-revolutionary campaigns had not really deserved to die. But lower levels sometimes get carried away and they take things too far. There is other evidence from within the Soviet bureaucracy and telegrams and communiques and so on, and I am happy to refer people to the articles that discuss these. But today we are primarily concerned with how people and animals in this multi-species society experienced the campaign, which turned out to be based on false premises. If we reject the notion of American BW, then what were people seeing and reporting as possible BW materials? Let's talk a bit about the voles of Gannan. Several prominent Chinese scientists insisted that China lacked the technological capacity to breed lab rats or other rodents. And this is a quite difficult aspect of animal husbandry. You know, my first book is all about raising cattle and giving them good conditions and so on, but raising lab animals is an art of itself, to create genetically standardized animals in very close confinement, often eating a very artificial diet. So it's not an easy thing to do. However, there were over 1,000 Japanese and nationalist prisoners held at a rehabilitation center in Fushun in Liaoning province until 1956. Based on the records of their interrogations, we know that many of them had no connection to BW, but some had extensive experience breeding and transporting rats, insects, and bacteria during the Japanese program. This contradicts the claim that China lacked people with the ability or the knowledge of how to raise lab animals. Furthermore, in addition to these POWs, there were several elite Chinese scientists, such as Chen Wengui, who we will discuss in a moment, who were highly qualified and also knew how to breed lab animals. We can account for these voles around Gannan as, you know, coming in this kind of extraordinary, you know, dozens of cardboard tubes that incinerated and left no trace, or in my, if you forgive me, more plausible interpretation, animals bred in Chinese laboratories could have been carried in cages to the appropriate sites and dropped off from the back of a truck in the middle of the night. The important thing to remember here is that as far as the people who discovered these animals were concerned, it was still a very scary and kind of unexplainable event. So this does not require some vast conspiracy, which has long been one of the critiques of people who, you know, say, well, it had to be America because otherwise you'd have tens of thousands of Chinese civilians, you know, just telling lies when they spoke with the ISC or when they wrote their memoirs. I don't think that's the case at all. I think they believed what they were seeing was genuine, but it wasn't. This is particularly apparent when we look at the very scary images and messages that people were getting from their government. Here we have a couple of images of animals as American avatars. In the first image, we see a blue-skinned, creepy-looking humanoid surrounded by insects and rodents. On his shoulder is a smiling rodent with Nazi headgear, and on his side is a rat with a Japanese soldier's hat and the label Xijun bacteria. In the second picture, image 3 here, we have masked medical and hygienic personnel burying the attacker and his animal allies. And you can see it's the same attacker because of this bandaged leg. The captions explain that Americans, represented by the blue man here, disregarded international norms and sprayed bacteria over North Korea, Manchuria, and the city of Qingdao. But not to worry, the peace-loving people of Korea, China, and the whole world teamed up against this doomed aggression. In this second picture, we see, or third picture of this, we see a bestial, hairy American hand with claws in a uniform where the sleeve has the Nazi swastika, the skull and crossbones, the Japanese rising sun, and the almighty dollar on an American flag background. And the bayonet here is labeled the People's Armies of China and North Korea, while the pesticide sprayer shooting out this cloud of poison and killing all these fleas and insects that have escaped from this nasty-looking vial or beaker, this pesticide sprayer says, the peace-loving peoples of the world. So the viewers are encouraged to view these animals, rats, flies, and spiders, as American allies or attackers. The bayonet simultaneously slicing through the arm of the rat and the arm of the American suggests that to kill pests is to wound the American aggressor. But rodents and insects were not the only animals put at risk during these campaigns of hygienic violence. Here we can talk about two key concepts, outsourced agency and collateral killing. Here's an image of about 400 dead birds, and the caption is very difficult to read here, but they're labeled as dichenyao, discovered in a field in Guangdong province in 1952. The local hygiene authorities soon incinerated these cadavers in the belief that they were vectors or victims of American BW. From this archival material, which was generously shared with me by a Chinese scholar, it is impossible to determine the precise cause of death. But this sort of mass bird death was very common in the USA during the 1950s and, in fact, motivated the ecologist Rachel Carson to write her famous book Silent Spring on the hazards of pesticides, including DDT. America had introduced DDT in China immediately after the Second World War to help with agricultural recovery. By the 1950s, the country was able to produce it domestically, but it was fairly expensive. Using durable, highly toxic chemicals to kill undesirable non-humans, in this case plague-bearing fleas, is an example of what I call outsourced agency. In other words, rather than organizing people to manually kill insects or kill animals, hygiene authorities could outsource some of their killing power to artificially created molecules. These linger in the environment, and recent scientific research dates the high levels of DDT in groundwater in northeastern China to widespread application of DDT in the 1950s. Some of this was for agricultural purposes, as we mentioned, but the party was also urging people during this campaign to spray DDT around their homes and villages. The compound was supposed to be safe for humans and highly lethal for the targeted insects. Unfortunately, it becomes concentrated as it moves through the food chains and is carcinogenic and toxic to mammals and birds. The effects on humans are still actually unclear, but it is detectable in breast milk, human breast milk. Organisms, including these birds, were victims of what I call collateral killing, or we could even call interspecies friendly fire. Because the DDT molecule is so persistent, it kills across time, long after the original threat is past. An earlier chapter of this second book discusses the Japanese military's use of BW against Chinese cities, including Changde and Ningbo, as I mentioned, during the war. That was another instance of outsourcing agency. I argue that due to shortages of raw materials and industrial capacity for making conventional weapons such as bombs and artillery, the Japanese BW scientists realized that they might outsource some human killing power to microbes such as plague and typhoid. Lethal, easy to transport, and endlessly self-reproducing, these cells were the gift that keeps on giving. They also became endemic in rodent populations, killing rodents and people even after the Japanese surrender. So from these examples, we can see that agency can be outsourced to inert molecules like pesticides, to bacteria, or of course in the rhetoric of the environmental hygiene campaigns, to rodents and insects who were supposed to be American avatars. It turned out, though, that the Americans were not the only ones who could outsource their lethality to animals. This image, unfortunately, is displaying a bit blurry. It's not because I want to protect your sensitive eyes from an upsetting image. It's just not showing up in the resolution I wanted. But it is a section of a larger poster showing ways of fighting back against American BW. The caption explains that people can catch a rat, pin its head down under a bowl, here, and use a stick to stuff its anus with soybeans and salt, and then sew it shut. When the animal drinks water, the beans will swell up and cause it discomfort. It will then become fierce and aggressive toward other rats and bite them to death. That's the theory. I have seen no evidence that anyone actually used this convoluted and frankly dangerous method. I still think this document is very important for a couple of reasons, though. First, we can see that hygiene authorities recognized rodents' capacity for pain and tried to use it against them, outsourcing agency to the animals to make them into rat killers. Culturally, images like this also encouraged people to view rodents as suitable targets for cruelty and vengeance. People can kill rodents with minimal pain, but the point of this technique, I think, was to nurture a belief that these animals were just awful, even willing accomplices of the American BW assault. So the campaign weaponized the pain of rodents in two ways: enlisting suffering animals to kill other animals, and enhancing civilians' contempt for these animal proxies of America. How did hygienic warfare benefit the party? in a number of ways. First, it united people against an external enemy, the treacherous United States and its animal allies. Remember, this was a country that China had just emerged from a very deadly civil war, so there's, the potential to focus people's distaste on an external enemy was very valuable. It also boosted the prestige and the legitimacy of the new PRC government and its biomedical or techno-scientific competence. We saw those images of the hygiene workers dealing with these attacks, using chemicals, using their expertise. America could do its worst, but the very scientifically capable party and government would be able to protect people. The campaign also gave people very far from the Korean peninsula a sense of contributing to national struggles. As we saw, Guangdong province was very active. I have documents from, provinces up and down the coast, southwestern China, places very far from the front lines of Korea. It also provided an urgent motivation for public health measures that frankly were a good idea, but people had been kind of unenthusiastic about them. Cleaning their homes, insect and rodent control, doing a lot of public outreach and education about disease transmission. These are all very sensible, but there was not a ton of buy-in until it became clear that, oh my God, America is attacking us. Now we've got to get our act together. What did civilians think of the hygienic warfare campaign? County-level archives and government communiques show the range of responses to the campaign at the grassroots. The party had to balance the need for outrage and indignation and this kind of motivational fear against the possibility of causing mass panic or refusal. Sometimes, records have examined, some entire villages locked themselves indoors and refused to come out because of fear of BW until they were browbeaten by hygiene authorities. Authorities also noted some people who were glad to join in, including one man who dug wells for drinking water day in and day out, and his main concern was that his wife would yell at him for neglecting his day job as a peddler. People in some southern provinces thought that they were not in any danger, as they were so far from the front lines. In one village, people refused to do environmental hygiene work because they were concerned that it might mess up their soil fertility, and they said that the government was just looking for trouble. And this last point about distance from the battlefield is important because the government propaganda emphasized the possibility that American airplanes could convey pathogens to areas that had many potential animal hosts but no endemic disease. The concern was, as they said, that rodents and insects are all around us, and we cannot allow the Americans to, as they said, connect internal and external threats by introducing such diseases. So for this reason, the hygienic violence campaigns imperiled animals pretty much nationwide, far from the combat zone. On the right side of this slide, we see an idealized image of a family practicing environmental hygiene. The caption says, "Everyone is beating rats. Fleas, lice, and stink bugs must be exterminated. Hurry up and eradicate flies and mosquitoes to prevent the spread of cholera and plague. Bacteria depend on harmful insects as vectors, so to eradicate harmful insects is to fight America." And you see people, someone's using a fly swatter here. This person maybe swatting at flies, or maybe doing another technique that they really urged people to do, which is patch up any nooks or crannies in your walls to deny those living spaces to rodents. And here we have a lady holding a mousetrap, I think, and then boiling her clothing to disinfect it. So people took part in a range of ways. How did the rodents experience the campaign? We've seen how the party and the state authorities benefited from the campaign and how people at the grassroots experienced their role. But as multi-species historians, what can we say about how rodents experienced being the targets of their campaign? It's impossible to quantify precisely, but tens of millions of rodents, according to gazetteers and government reports, were beaten, smoked, poisoned, trapped, and drowned, as well as the many animals that died in that collateral killing we've discussed. In the paper, I present scientific evidence of rodents' intelligence and emotional acuity. Rodents, by the way, are a really handy animal for the multi-species historian precisely because they have been the subject of so much laboratory research, so there's an enormous amount of data about them. It's much, if you're ever considering launching a multi-species history project, my one piece of advice is go with animals that have been domesticated for a long time and have been observed and carefully, their behavior has been very well studied by scientists. It would be much harder, although incredible, to do studies of wild animals about whom much less is known. Okay? Remember, we have evidence that rodents form social bonds, they have preferences and aversions, they have episodic memory, they have the capacity to plan and to learn from their experiences. So, with all this killing, am I equating their deaths to the deaths of humans? No. Am I saying that China was uniquely wicked in trying to eradicate so many animals? No. But we cannot understand the multi-species history of China without understanding how humans and non-humans affected each other. Rodents were responsible for an enormous amount of human activity in this time, human activity and ingenuity. And I think it is important to recognize that they are not mindless robots, but alert, sensitive, non-human beings. Many of the scientists, this is the one group of people we haven't really talked about, and they're important. Many of the scientists who lent their prestige to this pseudoscientific campaign had previously served in the nationalist or the Japanese puppet government. The PRC needed their expertise, but their loyalties were always suspect. Although there is evidence that many of these world-class scholars were not convinced about BW, they still signed off on the program and promoted it in editorials and overseas talks. I suggest that these experts were in a politically very precarious position. Anybody who was observant could see the danger of being labeled a counter-revolutionary or a dissident. Tang Feifan, for instance, had founded the National Epidemic Prevention Laboratory and helped the Kuomintang to produce penicillin in southwestern China during the anti-Japanese war. Now he denounced the, quote, mad dog Americans who have used the fruits of science to create a man-made disaster. Tragically for Tang, his loyalty was still in question, and he became a target during the campaign to uproot the white flag, i.e. capitalism, and he took his own life in 1958. Chen Wengui, who I mentioned earlier, had helped to investigate the Japanese military's use of plague against the city of Changde in Hunan province during the war. He was an expert on flea breeding and had studied plague at the Hafkin Institute in Mumbai, India, which was a key research site. Wu Zhili's memoir makes it clear that Chen had serious doubts about the use of BW in Korea, but he denounced America all the same. Chen was elected to the Chinese Academy of Sciences in 1955 and became a delegate to the National People's Congress in the 60s. Nevertheless, when he died in 1974, Chen had been labeled a counter-revolutionary during the Cultural Revolution. And finally, the pathologist Bai Xiqing had worked as a researcher in Japanese-occupied Manchukuo. He spoke out against alleged BW, and as we've mentioned, he alerted the ISC to the Japanese newspaper article about rodents in tubes. When he died in 1997, he had served as the president and secretary of the leading party group of the Chinese Medical Association, clearly a person who could navigate a politically difficult environment. I am not suggesting that these scientists were evil or that they were incompetent. They were working in a very politically fraught atmosphere, and they took steps that they felt were necessary to survive and to continue their careers. Additionally, they could justify the campaign to themselves as neutral or, possibly even beneficial, as it might reduce the likelihood of epidemic outbreaks. However, these scientists helped to facilitate the suffering and death of millions of intelligent animals. I'm not here to condemn these scientists, but to argue that such large-scale animal mortality deserves to be included when we discuss the compromises and the sacrifices that these scientists made. And finally, I am not singling out China for contaminating science with politics. After the Second World War, during something called Operation Paperclip, the USA collected and protected thousands of scientists from former adversaries, mainly Germany and Japan. This involved a lot of ethical compromises, and we can discuss that if you like. But during the 1950s, outstanding scholars such as Chen Xuesun, who is a great physicist, were accused of disloyalty and communist sympathies. And Chen, a brilliant scholar, left the USA for the PRC in 1955. So again, this is not just like, oh, pointing the finger at China, the bad guy, but saying, you know, when we consider the costs of pseudoscience, let's also bring into consideration the harm done to intelligent, sensitive non-humans. Speaking of American researchers, you've probably noticed that this talk has a different title than was advertised. That's because the chapter quickly outgrew its original framing. When the PRC denounced the American BW, American leaders, including the CIA chief Allen Dulles, assumed that the Red Chinese were using some kind of diabolical mind control, probably from the Soviet Union, to elicit false confessions from captured airmen. They had a handful of people who testified and made audio recordings saying, oh, I was involved in dropping BW on China. The CIA partnered with research universities across North America to explore mind-altering chemicals under the confidential program MKUltra. Most documentation from the program was destroyed in the 1970s, but it was generally considered a failure. Still, thousands of intelligent rodents, and indeed many humans, were subjected to psychedelic or hallucinogenic experiences without informed consent. This pseudoscientific endeavor of MKUltra forms a provocative parallel to the hygienic warfare campaign that originated it or motivated it. But because the chapter was already getting way too long, the American side will be discussed in another chapter. For now, we can just note that tripping on LSD can be traumatic, frightening, disorienting for people, particularly if they are not aware of what's going on. What might it be like for a rat? And finally, pseudoscience and interspecies violence, or in a nutshell, when scientists lie, animals die. Several important books have discussed the problems of pseudoscience. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway coined the term merchants of doubt to refer to the small number of scientists backed by large corporations who gave a veneer of credibility to theories rejected by the scientific consensus about the harms of tobacco or fossil fuel consumption. An earlier book, Betrayers of the Truth by Nicholas Wade and William Broad, emphasized the harms that resulted when researchers took shortcuts to advance their careers, including fabricating data or committing plagiarism. These books were significant contributions to our understanding, but they really focused only on the harm that pseudoscience did to human beings. In our study of hygienic violence, we have seen how an ideological or geopolitical impetus motivated the top level of the party state. We've seen how there was good faith participation from cadres and civilians at the grassroots. And we've seen the scientists' complex motives for participation. Also, participants in this event were the rodents and insects who became targets of state violence. An even more devastating case of interspecies violence is now, of course, happening with anthropogenic climate change. For decades, pseudoscientific narratives about the magnitude of harm from global warming helped to stifle public discourse and policy that would reduce fossil fuel consumption. Humans are, of course, not the only animals who will suffer as a result. We are now in the 6th great extinction in the history of the planet Earth. Whereas earlier mass extinction events were caused by geophysical processes, this one is on us. Pseudoscience has been with us for a long time, and it's not going away. I hope that when we tabulate the costs of pseudoscientific deception, we will consider the harm not only that it does to human beings, but also how it affects non-humans. Rodents do not speak English or Chinese, but they have friends and families, preferences and aversions, memories and plans, comfort and pain, just as we all do. Thank you. And I acknowledge and gratefully thank the LRCCS. And if you're curious, these are the image sources. And I'm happy to share the PowerPoint or the paper or whatever people want more about. But yes, I would love your questions or comments. Yes, please, Miranda.
Pete, I have to apologize because I have to leave in less than 10 minutes, but I want to ask you a question about pseudoscience, because one of sort of the most formative books I had as a graduate student sort of toying with science studies was the idea of asymmetry that, is in Bruno Latour, and, how he in some ways likes, how do I put it? So I guess I would like to hear more about the term pseudoscience and whether you find it to be, at some level normative. Is there a way perhaps that you could have flipped the narrative a little bit and framed it as like, here is a very successful Chinese campaign against epidemics, and, here was the process which, doesn't adhere to like a proper scientific method, So I guess, I'm interested in the politics of using that term, pseudoscience, and some of the theoretical commitments that go with that, if this makes sense.
Sure. Should I collect a bunch
you
of...
want to add something? Okay, the real science studies person is here.
Hi, I had my question. I had a question about that too, which and just everything she said. Plus, during the particular time you're talking about in the Cold War, when the United States real scientists are doing all this crazy BW work that's going on, it seems to create a sort of a weird understanding of the Cold War period and what science was up to label these things pseudoscience in a way that's really important for that understanding that particular period of time and the relationship between scientists and national security state in the United States, Soviet Union, China, all over the place.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that in this context, pseudoscience refers to the borrowing the kind of the credibility or the insignia, the regalia maybe of scientific inquiry with an outcome that is already fixed. In other words, you're using the appearance of doing science, but in a way that is not an open-ended inquiry. So, for instance, Wuchili talks about some fleas that were reported to the laboratory, and they were supposed to have been gathered after being dropped from American airplanes. In fact, the soldiers who reported them had found them in a cabin in the forest, and there was no connection at all to being dropped from air. But that was reported as, oh my God, these insects are being dropped. Then there's, he gets into the details of how most of these organisms had no bacterial presence, and so people would say, the microscopy specialists get the specimen, say, hey, it appears not to have any bacteria, and then they'd send along a tube of bacteria to help them to complete the narrative. So it's normative in the sense that the community of scientists, I think probably the fundamental thing is that when you launch or when you state a hypothesis, you do so without having already fixed the end goal. The hypothesis is there to be falsified, not reinforced by, frankly, manipulating the data. As for the American use of, or development of BW during this period, absolutely, like Fort Detrick and, there's an enormous amount of this stuff. Much of the American program, by the way, based on data and expertise from Japanese scientists captured or who surrendered after the Second World War, people from Unit 731, many who had done appalling things with human subjects. So I hope I've shed some light on that. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks, Pete, for this very interesting talk. It really kind of blows my mind because how you relate all those kind of 爱国卫生运动 to this warfare. And I also have a question regarding the role of humans in this history, not just as the actors that kill animals, but as perhaps the people who are being affected in terms of health or in terms of their political, I don't know, the status. Because when it is related, for example, to today's China's campaign against pandemic, I saw, for example, in the online memes, there are people who are testing COVID on animals, like they're testing fish. Testing
scientists or
no, not scientists, just those people who are doing this kind of anti-COVID campaigns, like those people who are wearing white.
Okay.
Yeah.
大白.
大白. Okay. Yeah. So that actually indicates something very interesting, that they are very harsh on animals too, but then on the other hand, they're also testing a lot on humans. So it's like they're also targeting on humans as this kind of health subjects. So I was wondering, for example, on a comparative level, how like humans as biological beings are, being affected by this this war in a sense. Are there people who are really, affected by these biological weapons in a sense, or claim them to be, or how are they being intervened by the government?
Okay. Yeah, there's a very exciting field of medical anthropology called One Health, which sees the welfare and the well-being of humans and animals and the environment as inextricably linked. So it sees these kind of very targeted efforts to eradicate a certain form of life with a broad-spectrum pesticide as potentially very risky, because there are inevitably going to be unintended consequences. When you apply something like DDT, yeah, you will kill the fleas in this room, but who knows how far out that lethality will radiate through the environment. In fact, you can get to situations where you use the pesticide to kill the fleas. Now birds are ingesting these contaminated organisms. Now you've got birds dying. Now you lose some of the natural pest control that you previously enjoyed from the birds and need to add additional pesticides. So there, it's when people start to intervene in these kinds of ways, it can easily have second and third order effects that are unforeseen or papered over at the time. Yes, please.
I was wondering, with all these, like animals that are fairly low on the food chain dying off, I was wondering how much did that disrupt, the food chain, and, did this go beyond just prey animals?
Well, it's hard to know. One of the big victims of DDT are earthworms, that do an enormous amount to promote soil fertility. So if you lose earthworms, that has downstream effects for a number of other forms of life. Unfortunately, I don't have quite enough data. I'm not sure anyone does to say explicitly, what was happening. But yeah, certainly, there are going to be unintended consequences. Yeah, I wish I could give you a richer answer than that. But yes, please, sir.
I'm thinking about rats in Chinese history, literature, and culture, right?
Yes.
So 12 people, you ask them what their sign is, they'll say they're a rat.
Including me.
Right. But more seriously, there's also this idea. So I teach fiction and drama, popular stuff. And then a very common type of story of shapeshifters, animals who can cultivate themselves and take on human shape.
Okay.
So Jing, there's that special term. It takes a long time to explain to folks what that's all about.
Yes.
Huli Jing is still used to talk about a vixen, for instance, right?
Sure.
And so original reaction to that was that to kill them, because they're a problem. They're alien, they're crossing the boundary.
Yes.
But eventually they're domesticated in big ways.
Yes.
So Pusongling, for instance, and then the most famous story of this kind is the white snake.
Okay.
And so she's accepted by most people, but you still have a Budinsky priest who insists on dividing the line. So have these ideas about fudging the boundary between not only human and animals, but even human and non-animate things. Has they any trace in the discourse when you're looking at Chinese relationships with non-humans?
It's a great question. In the earlier chapter about the BW attacks on, I particularly focused on Chengde because there was the most documentation. The government actually had to do quite a bit of kind of cultural work to get people hostile to rats. These were animals that, because they eat the same foods as humans, they live often just a few inches from humans, they have, recognizable well, I don't know if you'd say they're cute, but they do have little pups. So people, to a kind of shocking extent, from our very anti-rat perspective, people had a quite warm feeling about them. And there were all these folk stories of like a bunch of rats that had come up to a big urn full of oil, and they wanted to get inside, but they couldn't, so they dug out underneath, and then it tipped over, and everyone could drink the oil. And so there's like a lot of charming little folk stories that at that time, the nationalist government had to really tamp down and say, hey, these are actually a problem. They're not your friend or your familiar or anything like that. So, yes, thank you for that. Yes?
I wonder if you've thought about how this work, whether you've thought about how it maybe generalizes to other cases of how lab rats or lab mice get recruited into atrocity stories and into conspiracy theories. And I'm thinking, the only case I could think of offhand, but it seems related, it was the subject of a New York Times expose a couple of years ago, was the way that the conspiracy theory about AIDS originating in a lab kind of originated in Russia. And they spoke to a lot of Russian scientists or pseudoscientists or propagandists who talked about that, and was planted in newspapers around the world, as you mentioned before. But whether there's a case to be made about how this work relates to more recent cases of things like that.
Are you trying to get me to say something about COVID?
No, well, I don't know.
Okay.
But anything you'd want to speak to about that.
Well, I mean, what's astonishing to me as I'm looking at the history of modern science and medicine in 20th century China is the really, as far as I can tell, the use of lab animals on that scale, using thousands of them at a time, began with the Japanese program in Unit 731, and at that time, they were unable to breed enough, so they were paying people to go out into the countryside to just, as you say, recruit them, to gather them. But of course, that's very problematic as far as making sure that they are standardized animals. That's largely because these were being used as sources of blood that you would use to nourish fleas, which you would then infect with plague and send in bombs to strike other cities. So what I find really interesting is this transition from enlisting civilians to go out and gather animals for a bounty. They'd get X, currency for each rat they delivered, and then moving towards the controlled breeding of these animals in a much more standardized way. After the war, there were a lot of people in Manchuria, in particular, who had who felt that they had been misled or been wronged by being involved in that program of apprehending wild animals to be used in BW. They didn't know that that's what was going on. I'm not sure if that rises to the level of a conspiracy that you're talking about, but yeah, part of this concept of outsourcing agency is also, I'm going to develop in yet another chapter about what it means to decide, well, certain bodies are too valuable or too meaningful to experiment on, and therefore we have to choose comparable bodies that we can inject with drugs or we can do surgeries on, and the power dynamic inherent in that, whether the targeted bodies are humans, as in cases we've discussed, or whether they're lab animals. Whenever people are making those kind of decisions to sacrifice certain kinds of life in favor of others, I think the potential for conspiratorial attitude is there. Yes, Ina.
I have a question from one of our students. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. It seems that the PRC used very similar strategies during the Mao era. How can we understand this kind of movement, such as the sparrow eradication movement? Was it a method to release people's anxiety in society?
I don't think that thank you for that question. I don't think that the 除四害, eliminate the four harms, that's the campaign that this questioner is referring to, and those were, one of the big ones was sparrows. The rationale there was that sparrows were stealing people's grain. And therefore, you'd be working hard, and yet at the end of the day, you wouldn't get as much as you should have because these sparrows were stealing your grain. Similar arguments were made about rats actually during the 50s, but I think the big difference here is that the rats people were being encouraged to view the rats as American allies. Like, they were tools of America, they're fighting, basically wearing uniforms. Sparrows were, kind of unfortunately, their nature is such that they would steal humans' grain. I think that's more the framing that they went with. Yeah, okay, and then again.
I have another question from one of our former postdocs. What a fascinating talk. I like your perspective of looking at political and historical problems through the angle of interspecies tensions. I wonder if you've thought about the roots of this whole project of othering animals in modern China. For example, in traditional China, animals such as foxes and snakes were routinely associated with bad spirits and mostly evil motives. How do we understand modern China's anti-animal campaign in the context of animals and others in Chinese history?
Well, that's a very big question. I thank you. I don't know. I guess the person is referring again to the Eliminate the Four Harms or the Four Pests campaign. I'll put it this way. Attitudes about animals and their relationships to humans are very deeply embedded in every society. I think one of the hardest tasks that the CCP had to do when they took power was to kind of demystify a lot of animals. My first project on bovines is very much focused on this. People were enormously attached to their ox. It was their colleague. It was their companion. They cared for it for decades. It was the source of their draft labor. It was enormously important. And the party had to do an enormous amount of cultural work to get people to say, hey, this ox is not plowing as well as it used to. It's off to the slaughterhouse. That people really resisted that. And likewise with rats, people had these kind of familiarity with these animals. They had a certain, it's almost like if you've lived in company with animals for so long, it's almost like they don't strike you as a dangerous enemy. And so the party had to do this kind of over-the-top propaganda to change people's perspectives. So getting people to view animals more instrumentally and less emotionally or less spiritually. That's another whole, we could talk a great deal about the Buddhist beliefs underpinning a lot of people's relationships to animals too, and the party was not a fan of those. So they had to do a lot of persuasion and even kind of coercion or pressure to get people to shift from an understanding of themselves as living in and among animals who had minds to seeing them as more of an asset or of a tool or of, in this case, an enemy. Yeah, I'm always hesitant. I don't even really like these terms like traditional China and modern China. We use them, of course, but I don't like to make those big dividing lines. And I wouldn't say that China today is particularly anti-animal either. I couldn't quite tell if that was something implied in the question, but the United States certainly doesn't have a great track record on animals either. So, other questions? You had no.
What about sparrows?
Yes.
We associate them with urban culture, like pigeons.
Yes.
And the Maoists were pretty anti-urban. Is there an aspect of that? First off, is it bullshit that sparrows are urban critters?
Yeah, actually, during this campaign, a lot of them were being killed out in the countryside. I would say the majority of what I've seen is actually that they were more of a rural creature. Yeah.
I actually had questions about Korea.
Yeah.
I know, this was supposed to be thought of in tandem with Korea, and of course you've been talking more about China, which is totally appropriate, but I wanted to know more about Korea and their circumstances on this topic. I don't really have any other questions than that. I'm just looking to get a sense of how they thought and how they reacted, if differently.
Yeah. Probably the most noteworthy thing I can mention is that they specifically requested Chen Wengui to go and do the investigations because of his track record in the Second World War, when the Japanese did, in fact, use BW. it's because we don't have access to Korean archives. It's hard to know how roped into the deceit they were, whether they were, taking advice from the Chinese Communist Party or what. I can't really give you a satisfying answer about that, but certainly the Korean government decorated Chun and a couple of the other scientists during the 1950s, gave them orders of merit for their contributions. So they were, at least at that time, still very much advancing this narrative of BW. Yeah. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate your listening, and if anybody wants to contact me, my email is on the board, and thank you again.